While the early days of the First Age were filled with mighty battles of such proportion so as to not be seen upon the shores of Middle-earth until the sundering of Beleriand, what was to come in the latter half of this epoch was a slow, brutal demise for the Free Peoples. For even as Elf, Dwarf and Edain struggled ever onwards against the malicious machinations of Morgoth, they were all deceived. For as they fought tooth and nail to ensure that day would come again, their efforts were in fact aiding the Dark Lord in his scheming to establish himself as the dominant power in Middle-earth. This paradoxical struggle was reflected most clearly in the dark and brutal life of Turin Turambar, and as such this is where our tale, the retelling of the fall of Morgoth, begins. Stopping Morgoth is one thing, but what if the people of Middle-earth could convert Morgoth to serve them? That's the kind of power you can harness with the sponsor of this video, Dungeon Hunter 6. This is a fast-paced hack-and-slash action RPG in which you collect heroes and establish powerful builds to defeat the myriad bosses waiting for you in countless dungeons. It's free to play, and you can get it via the link below or the QR code on screen if you're on PC. Defeat bosses to use them as mounts, or summon several into your party to create unique combinations of their powers, with special combo moves and the ability to power up even further with late-game shape-shifting abilities. This latest entry in the Dungeon Hunter series brings new and improved 3D graphics and brilliant animations, while also optimizing performance for a smooth ride on mobile devices. There's PvE and PvP combat, and you can join or create guilds to play with friends, help each other test out the endless skill builds and find what works for each challenge, and trade items with each other via the auction system. To get started, use our link in the description on Android or iOS, or the QR code on screen for PC. It's absolutely free, and to make it even better, our link gives you $50 of in-game items as a starting bonus, including the powerful demonic wolf summon. And if you want even more free stuff, enter their Lucky Spin event to win real prizes, like an iPhone 15 or PS5. Full details will be in the description. Get all this good stuff right now with Dungeon Hunter 6. I am the Elder King Melkor, first and mightiest of all the Valar, who was before the world and made it. The shadow of my purpose lies upon Arda, and all that is in it bends slowly and surely to my will. But upon all whom you love my thought shall weigh as a cloud of doom, and it shall bring them down into darkness and despair. Wherever they go, evil shall arise. Whenever they speak, their words shall bring ill counsel. Whatsoever they do shall turn against them. They shall die without hope, cursing both life and death. The curse of Morgoth upon the children of Húrin. Turin was the sole son of Húrin Thalion and Moren Elethén, with a younger sister named Urwen, nicknamed Lalaith because of her easy demeanor and frequent bouts of laughter. By comparison, he was an old soul with a sullen nature, and it was only on rare occasions that he was to speak. This mood was not improved when Lalaith passed away early in their childhood due to a plague. The situation in Dor Lómin was to worsen spectacularly following the Nernaeth Enoediet, as the ever-deceitful Morgoth had betrayed his Easterling allies by ensconcing them within the less fertile lands of Hithlum. Frustrated by their place of low standing, despite their vital role in the Dark Lord's ascendancy, the Easterlings kept the Northerners in a state of perpetual repression. Morwen, pregnant with the final child of Húrin, surveyed the ever-darkening days of her people and decided upon a heart-breaking course of action. She would send Turin away to be fostered within King Thingol's halls in Doriath. The path was not an easy one. However, the safety of Turin and his companions was practically assured when they came upon one of the most formidable elves of that period, Beleg Cuthalion. He provided the weary company with food and guidance, and brought them to the halls of Thingol. Here, Turin would gaze upon the great marvels of Menegroth, a feat which had only been achieved by one human, Beren, one of the greatest of his kind. When Turin met Thingol, he was welcomed with great honor due to the feats of his father Húrin and his kinsman Beren. He was placed upon the king's knee, which was a sign that Thingol had adopted the boy as his own son. This was all the more surprising following the loss of his Luthien. Many elves believed that the actions of Turin's kinsman Beren played a role in the death of the king's daughter. Still, Thingol proclaimed, "Here, son of Húrin, shall your home be, and in all your life you shall be held as my son, man though you be. Wisdom shall be given you beyond the measure of mortal men, and the weapons of elves shall be set in your hands. Perhaps the time may come when you shall regain the lands of your father in Hithlum, but dwell now here in love." Thingol's wise wife Melian attempted to bring Morwen to Doriath in order to avert the doom of her children, yet the latter would not abandon her people so lightly, and instead sent the great dragon helm of Dor-lómin. Thingol would safeguard this mighty relic of the House of Hador until such a time when Turin would be able to wield it as the head of his household. During this period, Turin learned much from the elves, particularly from an elf maiden named Nellas. Although the great darkness within his heart was lifted for a time, during his 9-year sojourn within Doriath, his restlessness was to return. His thoughts would often return to his mother and sister. He had never met Nienor, of whom he knew only that her beauty had become such that she was now considered a flower in the Grey North. During this stay, Turin had matured into a fine representative of the House of Hador, with his stature surpassing even the elves of Doriath. His strength and hardiness earned him great renown within the kingdom. From Beleg he learned much, and had begun to show signs of the peerless warrior and woodsman he was to become. Yet his manner and inherent sadness often held him back from forging friendships among the denizens of Doriath, which, combined with his more impressive characteristics, led one elf to envy and begrudge him. Still, King's counsellor Saeros seemed unable to provoke the young man, and the silence with which he answered his cruel jests only furthered the jealous grudge which the elf held against the scion of the House of Hador. Turin's 17th year was to prove a deciding one, bringing to an end the comfortable existence he had enjoyed within the girdle of Melian, as ill tidings now came from the north. Morgoth's power had grown exponentially, to a point at which all of the north now lay within his grasp, and no further word from the messengers of Thingol would come regarding the land of Dor-lómin. So Turin, who still has not reached manhood, took from the king the great dragon helm of his father and his father's father, and ranged far and wide alongside his mentor Beleg. Such was the fury and the weight of the doom which lay upon his shoulders that word soon raced throughout the lands of the north that Húrin himself had returned from the very depths of hell to wage war upon those who had wronged his people. 3 years would pass, with Turin devoting himself entirely to the cause of striking back against the Dark Lord, and in this time he began to care little for his appearance, or even the seat he had once held at the side of his foster father. On one of his seldom visits to his former home in Menegroth, he came within its halls only to discover that Thingol was in fact absent. Weary from his journeys, Turin took the first seat he could find, which happened to be by the side of the elders of the realm. Saeros arrived late, and presumed that pride caused Turin to take such a place. The councillor then began to belittle and torment the man of Dor-lómin, with one particular jest as to the quality of their womenfolk finally provoking Turin. At this, he cast his drinking vessel at the face of the elven councillor and drew his sword. If it were not for Mablung, he would have attacked Saeros. Sufficiently calmed by Mablung, Turin sheathed his blade and left without a word. Angered by his fellow elf's conduct, Mablung decreed that should any further ill come from the encounter, it should lay at Saeros's feet. However, the latter was not abated by such words, and attempted to waylay Turin as he left the kingdom. Unfortunately for the elf, the years spent in the wilderness had made the young man wary of such tactics. Seeing Saeros from the corner of his eye, Turin moved aside, and his strike split the elf's shield in twain. The fight which ensued was fierce, yet Turin combined the agility of an elf with far greater strength. He disarmed the elf, and with him now at his mercy, he threw the councillor to the ground and stripped him of his clothing. Saeros cried for help, and fled into the forests with Turin in mock pursuit. The councillor, fearing the wrath of Turin, ran ahead with such pace that when he came to a stream and failed in his leap across it, he crashed into the rocks and died instantly. Hearing the commotion, Mablung and the other elves came upon the scene, unaware of Sairos's attack. They asked Turin to go with them to face the judgment of Thingol. However, the son of Húrin was unwilling and left the kingdom with none eager to stop him for fear of further bloodshed. None among the people of Doriath knew where Turin was now headed, for he had kept his course secret until he came across an outlaw band based in the south of Brethil. He identified himself only as Naithan, or the Wronged, and as he was now in the full vigor of his manhood, the outlaws quickly realized that he far outstripped any of them in terms of strength of arms, and did not object to him joining their company. His prowess was further evidenced when the leader of the group insisted on terrorizing an innocent woman. In response, Turin slew the man, assuming his role as leader of the group. From now on, the band would only hunt orcs, and with Turin at their head, they would instill fear in all who served the Dark Lord within the region. Meanwhile, Thingol and Melian finally returned to Doriath, and the king called upon his councillors to direct his foster son's judgment. Mablung spoke at length, but could not forgive the slaying of Sairos despite the taunting. As a result, the king was about to pronounce his judgment, which would not favour his adopted son. At the last minute, however, Beleg burst into the hall and made overtures to be heard by his king. When this was accepted, he brought Nellas, who had witnessed the beginning of the fight. Her testimony would prove vital in exonerating Turin, and having questioned her at length, Thingol would pardon his adopted son and task Beleg with returning him to Doriath. Armed with the mighty black blade Anglachel, forged from the metal of a falling star, Beleg set forth with the blessing of Thingol and Melian. Beleg, unceasing in his efforts to find his dear companion of old, continued the search long after all other messengers of Thingol had given up the pursuit, and in FA 487 he came upon the band at the outskirts of the Amon Ruth. He was promptly captured and tied up here, for Turin was not with the band. Fortunately, he soon returned and had his friend released, despite the protests and continued distrust towards the elf from his lieutenant Andrug. Beleg initially attempted to have Turin return to Doriath with him. However, Turin showed the steadfast loyalty of his house, saying that he would not leave his men to their fate. As such, Beleg returned to Doriath in order to inform the king that his foster son was alive. In the meantime, Turin came upon the petty dwarves Mim and his son Kim. These were some of the last of their kind, a group of minor dwarves that came from the ancient Hold's exiles. The band hastily captured Mim, but in the scuffle, Androg accidentally slew Kim, which left the surviving father bitter and rageful. In exchange for his freedom, Mim was forced to share the halls he dwelt within on Amon Ruth with the company. He also received a payment of ransom for the death of his son. This is the reason behind the halls being nicknamed the House of Ransom. That winter, Beleg returned to Turin and won over many within the band through his aptitude for healing. Beleg also brought with him the dragon helm that Turin had left in Doriath, so the region became known as Dor Cuathol, or the Land of Bow and Helm. Turin took up a new name in this epoch of his life, Gorthol the Dread Helm. Here the warrior would bring great fame and renown to the band, drawing many new recruits. As a result, a vast swath of western Beleriand was freed from the evil that had held the land in sway for so long. Yet the rage of Mim was to ensure that the curse of Morgoth would once more wreak havoc upon the House of Hador. The petty dwarf decided to get his revenge, so he met with the orcs, providing information fatal to Turin's band. His conditions included the return of his halls, iron and gold for all those caught, that Beleg was imprisoned and left to him, and that Turin was allowed to go free. Yet the conditions were somewhat altered by the orcs, who decided they would take Turin to Angband. To guarantee his cooperation, the orcs took Mim's surviving son, Ibn, hostage. So the petty dwarf led the orcish company to the halls of ransom. Although this was a surprise, the sentries bought the band a fraction of the time needed to prepare a defense, The orcs were initially driven back by the ferocity of man and elf, yet before long the company was forced to retreat within the halls and roll a large stone across its entrance. Here, Andrúg revealed a hidden stair which led to the flat summit of Amon Rûth, where the small group of orcs who had made their way up the outer path were driven from the ledge. A last-ditch defense was mounted against the orcs now scaling the summit. However, there was little cover, and many of Turin's company were feathered by black arrows from below. Andrúg was mortally wounded in such a manner. As only Beleg, Turin and 10 other men were left alive, they withdrew to the center of the summit, and, with their backs to a standing stone, started a desperate last stand. Their numbers dwindled until none but Beleg and Turin survived. These two were taken captive as the orcs ravaged the halls. While Turin was taken to Angband, Beleg was left to Mim, who was angered further by the sacking of his home. Unbeknownst to the petty dwarf, Andrúg yet lived, and this valiant warrior had crawled inch by inch through the dead bodies of his comrades. Having already set his initial misgivings of the elf aside through the long war they had waged against the dying of the light, he saved his life, thrusting his blade towards the deceitful dwarf, who subsequently fled. With the last of his strength, Andrúg cut the fetters which bound his comrade. As Beleg turned to heal his friend, the last of the men of the company bade him farewell, stating, "My hurts are too deep even for your healing." Beleg was now left alone among the slain, with only a frail hope that Turin yet lived. However, the elves of Beleriand had long since learned to live with naught more than a fool's hope to guide them. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Halls of Ransom and the death of Andrúg, Beleg sought out Turin among the dead to give him a fitting burial. When he realized that his old friend was not among the slain, Strongbow deemed a flicker of hope yet remained to him. Beleg tracked the orcs to the highlands of Taur Nufuin, where he came upon a sleeping elf, Gwyndor, the son of Guilin, an escaped slave of Angband after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, brought low by the vile machinations of the torturers of the Dark Lord. Gwyndor informed Beleg of a small company of orcs just ahead of them. The broken elf attempted to dissuade Beleg from pursuit. However, the latter would not leave his friend to his fate. Beleg continued onwards until he came across the camp of the orcs, who now caroused in celebration of their victory and set out only wolf sentinels to alert them of any oncoming foe. A great storm came from the far west, disguising the ambitions of Beleg and Gwyndor. In the brutal darkness of the night, Beleg shot dead 4 of the wolf sentries to the southern side of the encampment, before making his way into the camp and slaughtering those who were awoken by their entrance. Gwyndor and Beleg bore the fettered Turin from the campsite. As Beleg began to cut loose the bond which kept Turin, the blade, Anglachel, bit into Turin's foot. Turin immediately sprung upon his would-be assailant, slaying Beleg Cuthalion. A great lightning strike then illuminated the scene, evidencing to Turin that he had slain his friend, which caused him to scream aloud in such sadness that it would awaken the orcs. However, Turin and Gwyndor managed to escape the servants of Morgoth. Gwyndor roused Turin, saying he would aid in burying Beleg. This action renewed within Gwyndor the strength and virtue of his people, so he guarded and guided Turin away from the area where he had committed his most heinous deed to date. He brought him to the pools of Ivrin, where the madness of Turin was cured, allowing him to weep for all the woe he had wrought upon those he had loved. At this point, Gwyndor bestowed upon Turin the blade Anglachel and asked the Edain to come with him to his home, Nargothrond. Due to the standing Gwyndor previously held within the kingdom, Turin was accepted into the kingdom of Orodreth. He took upon himself a new name, Agarwine, son of Urmath, which in the Sindarin tongue meant bloodstained, son of ill fate. He did so in the hopes that he would be able to mask his identity and so avoid the dark cloud which held perpetual sway over his family. The finest smiths available within the halls of Nargothrond then reforged Anglachel, and in the process, a new name was required for the blade to remove the taint the blade now bore following the death of Beleg. The blade therefore came to be known by the name Gurthang, or Iron of Death in Sindarin. As Turin embodied all that made the House of Hador foremost among the Edain of those days, the attention of the daughter of Orodreth, Finduilas, was drawn to him. Yet despite her beauty, Turin spurned her advances, as she had once been his friend Gwyndor's beloved before his imprisonment. As Gwyndor's star continued to wane within the kingdom, the man he had brought from the brink of madness assumed an ever more prominent position within Nargothrond, becoming a counsellor to Orodreth. Although he was now in adulthood, Turin had never fully tempered the rage and darkness within, and his thoughts turned ever northwards. Turin advocated for an abandonment of the secrecy that had allowed the kingdom to survive in the aftermath of continued setbacks against the Dark Lord. Turin's bold defiance of the norms that had served the kingdom's people for so long soon got him the ear of the more prominent elves of the kingdom, with Orodreth foremost among them. This drew the ire of Gwyndor, who had witnessed firsthand the strength of the Dark Lord and the cruelty he could bring to bear if sufficiently challenged. As a result, the two friends were put at odds with one another in the council meetings of the king, and in time, Gwyndor would come to rue the decision which had brought the son of Húrin to his home. For Turin's words, passionate as they were, came to win the day and spur the king to action. Though mortal men have little life beside the span of elves, they would rather spend it in battle than fly or submit. The defiance of Húrin Thalion is a great deed, and though Morgoth slay the doer, he cannot make the deed not to have been. Gwyndor's hard-won wisdom was thus ignored, and his position among the king's councillors was diminished. Orodreth, inspired to act against the great foe of his people, prepared to meet the Dark Lord's forces once more in the field, and strike a significant blow against the darkness which now engulfed much of North Beleriand. A great collection of arms was amassed within the halls of Nargothrond. At the urging of the still disguised Turin, a masterfully wrought bridge was constructed to provide a crossing over the Narog from the doors of Felagund. This would allow much hastier travel of warriors to the guarded plain, where most of the fighting was to take place. In this period, Gwyndor fell even further into disrepute due to his undeserved reputation for cowardice and the infirmity which continued to plague him from the wounds inflicted upon him within the depths of Angband. By contrast, Turin had grown into the fullness of his manhood, and his physical strength and courage drew the admiration of all within the kingdom. To ensure a stray arrow did not fell their valiant champion, Turin was outfitted with masterwork dwarven armor, and within the depths of the armories of Nargothrond, Turin found for himself a gilded dwarven war mask. Turin, having donned this array of impenetrable armaments, would instill such fear among the orcs that they would flee without even giving battle. Despite all preparations, the forces of King Orodreth stood as naught more than a flickering flame before the impending crescendo of Morgoth's vengeance upon the House of Hador. For some 5 years after Turin had arrived within his halls, a warning came from the Valar Ulmo himself through messengers of Círdan of the peril in which the kingdom now found itself. Unfortunately, Turin, who had assumed the role of commander of Nargothrond's armed forces, counselled against a tactical retreat and the dismantling of the bridge, believing that the forces amassed could now stand against any host Morgoth could bring to bear. Soon after the messengers who had borne such warnings to Nargothrond had departed in search of Turgon of Gondolin, an orcish host had moved against the men of Brethil, routing them and slaying their lord Handir. In doing so, they secured the crossings of Teiglin, and so the Dark Lord's hosts could amass reprisals in the Pass of Sirion without fear. Here a vast horde of orcs was gathered, with Glaurung, the father of dragons, at its head, and with the coming of autumn, the people of Nargothrond were to know the wrath and malice of the Dark Lord. First, the great Drake despoiled the Eithel Ivrin, followed by the burning of the Taleth Durnan as he passed into the guarded plain of Nargothrond. The elves of that fair kingdom would not bend in the face of such overwhelming odds, and with Turin at their head, they met their foe in the field. However, Glaurung's might in those days was so great that none but their mighty Edain captain, by virtue of his dwarven armor, could stand before the dragon. for upon the fields of Tumhalad, the forces of Nargothrond were routed. The pride and might Turin had instilled upon the elves of that kingdom withered as fruit upon the vine, and before the day was at its end, Orodreth himself lay dead upon the field of battle. Gwyndor too was mortally wounded, and if not for the intervention of Turin, for all fled before his might with great haste, his life would have come to a brutal end at the hands of the orcs. Bearing away his friend, Turin was forced to leave him to his fate, as Gwyndor lay the blame of that bloody day at his feet, and tasked him with saving his beloved Finduilas. Now, if thou love me, leave me. Haste thee to Nargothrond, and save Finduilas. And this last I say to thee, she alone stands between thee and thy doom. If thou fail her, it shall not fail to find thee. Farewell. Making with all haste possible, and gathering to him what elves still remained, Turin arrived too late to save the kingdom of Nargothrond. For the bridge he had advocated for and shown such pride towards was to be the unmaking of the people he had been tasked with defending, as it was so finely wrought that it could not be quickly dismantled. Glaurung, with the full force of his flame, brought low the doors of Felagund, and a brutal and bloody sack ensued. The remaining garrison was routed, while the women of Nargothrond, Finduilas among them, were taken captive, intending to bring them to Angband. Turin already failed the kingdom by allowing the shadow of his doom to bring such a mighty people low, and he could not countenance its survivors facing the immeasurable anguish of Angband. The bearer of the dragon helm of Dor Lomin drove back all who dared face him, and their number was few to begin with, as naught more than a handful dared to face this son of Húrin in his full might. However, the curse of Morgoth was not so easily evaded. As he made his way towards the captives, Turin suddenly found himself alone upon the bridge, as his companions had either fled or been slain in the desperate attempt to recover the enslaved. Just as it seemed Turin would be able to save the womenfolk, Glaurung emerged from the doors of Felagund at Turin's back and spoke, drawing away the warrior's attention. Turin's eyes bore a great flame within them, and reflected upon the edges of Gurthang as he stood alone yet unafraid and returned the great dragon's gaze, which was to prove his undoing. Glaurung was a being of immense strength, yet his guile and capacity for deception were the sharpest of the talons available to him, and Turin was transfixed, as if turned to stone by the witchcraft of the great drake's eye. Unable to move, Turin was forced to endure the vile machinations of Glaurung, who spoke vile mistruths that the Edain believed wholeheartedly due to the spell which now lay upon him. The dragon then gave a signal, and the orcs drove their captives as cattle across the bridge, among them Finduilas, who cried aloud and reached out for the unmoving Turin. However, the dragon would only release Turin when the captives were far from his reach. As soon as the bearer of the dragon helm was released from the dragon's glare, he cast himself at his great foe. Glaurung initially attempted to dissuade Turin from such action by speaking of the immediate peril his mother and sister now found themselves in, yet this was not sufficient, and Turin struck out with his black blade, attempting to take the dragon's eye. Glaurung moved with speed, belying his great size and avoiding the blow. He was impressed with the courage of the lone man he now faced. Speaking naught more than poison once more into the ears of this mighty Edain, he convinced Turin to leave Finduilas to her fate. Haste you now, son of Húrin, to Dor Lomin, or perhaps the orcs shall come before you once again. And if you tarry for Finduilas, then never shall you see Morwen or Nienor again, and they will curse you. Turin turned and sped away to the north to save his mother and sister, which drew a laugh from the great dragon, who had achieved the aim of his lord through such a masterful deception. In the act of symbolic desecration, Glaurung destroyed the very bridge which had brought low the kingdom of Nargothrond, and made a hoard of the great wealth which had been amassed there, resting upon it for a while. Turin, meanwhile, made his way ever northward, with the poisonous deception of Glaurung still ringing in his ears, despite the coming of a brutal winter. With each step he took, Finduilas' cries of anguish could be heard ever louder, yet the image of Dor Lomin, destroyed and his kin slain, drove Turin, son of Hurin, ever closer to his doom. Following a long and arduous trek through the frozen wilderness of Beleriand in the harsh winter, Turin finally came to the land of his birth and found himself a stranger among his people. The Easterlings had asserted their rule over Dor-lómin, with Turin's people now becoming the serfs of the region. Coming to his mother's home, he found it to be a pale reflection of the former dwelling of Hurin, as the Easterlings had sacked it. It was occupied by their chief Brodda, who had taken Turin's kinswoman Eirinn as his wife. Having been informed that his mother Morwen had made her way south with his sister Nienor in tow a year and 3 months ago, Turin was driven to immense anger and drew his black blade within the Great Hall. In the blink of an eye, Turin grasped the chieftain in his arm and placed Gurthang to his throat. Only then was the deception of Glaurung revealed. Norwen and Nienor had made their way to Doriath in search of the bearer of the Dragon Helm. At that moment, as the deception faded in an instant, the cries of Finduilis could be heard in a brutal pitch to the perpetually cursed son of the House of Hador, yet it would be too late to append the cruel dictates of fate. Turin threw Brodda at the other Easterlings, breaking the chieftain's neck. A battle ensued within the hall, and Turin slew 3 more Easterlings in a heartbeat. The men of Dor-lómin, who were enslaved for so long beneath the cruel yoke of their oppressors, rose up, and with their aid, Turin killed many Easterlings. Turin then left Dor-lómin, and although the Easterlings hunted him, he could hide out the brutal winter with a number of the men of his father's former domain, who had decided to live as free men rather than thralls to the Easterlings. As Turin turned to view the land of his forefathers one final time, the plumes of smoke rising from Dor-lómin indicated that in a final act of defiance, Eirinn had set the Great Hall on fire and ended her life in the process. One of the men of Dor-lómin explained that Turin had misjudged his kinswoman Eirinn's patience for weakness. Many a man of arms misreads patience and quiet. She did much good among us at much cost. Her heart was not faint, and patience will break at the last. When the snow melted, Turin, now at a crossroads and uncertain of what course to take, came upon the much depleted men of Haleth within the forest of Brethil. Following multiple encounters with the forces of Angband, they had been significantly reduced in number, and were now so few to now mainly reside within a bare wooden stockade named Efilbrandir under their liege lord Brandir, son of Handir. Devastated though they may have been, the men of Brethil were far from a broken people, and some of the woodsmen who lived within the Efilbrandir continued to strike against Morgoth by hunting his orcish warbands. As Turin made his way through the forest, he heard a confrontation of man and orc, and quickened his pace to lend his aid. A small band of men had been trapped by a much larger orcish rabble, and would be slain to a man in their current predicament. Turin began to make a great noise, as if to indicate a large group of men were on their way to reinforce the weary defenders. Then he uttered a cry to initiate the charge. When Turin emerged from the tree line with Gurthang in hand, his appearance caused most of the orcs to take flight, with the remaining being chased off by the surviving men of Brethil. However, the victory was fleeting for Turin, as he inquired about Finduilis, and their leader Dorlas relayed the sad tale. Having followed the progress of the slow-moving orcish force which had come from Nargothrond, the men of Brethil conducted an ambush, and as the orcs were assaulted, they began to slaughter their captives. For Finduilis, a particularly brutal end was envisaged by her captors, as they fastened the daughter of Orodreth to a tree using a spear. Her final words were to tell Turin of her resting place. As a result, they buried her in a mound upon a hillock at the crossing of Teiglin, and when Dorlas and his company brought Turin to the mound, he broke down into such inconsolable grief that they believed him to be dead. At this point, the men of Brethil realized that the Black Sword himself had saved them, and they then brought him back to the Efilbrandir. Their liege lord Brandir, despite the reservations he maintained due to the curse which lay upon the shoulders of the man brought before him, still tended to Turin, and he woke once more in the spring. The courage of his forebears was awakened in Turin, and a new optimism for his future with it. All my deeds and past days were dark and full of evil, but a new day has come. Here I will stay at peace and renounce name and kin, so I will put my shadow behind me, or at least not lay it upon those I love." From that day, Turin decided he would now dwell within the Ethelbrandir and take a new name, Turambar, or Master of Doom. He set aside Gurthang and would instead fight with the spear or bow as he continued to hunt the orcs and defend the mound of his beloved Finduilis, which came to bear the name Hulth an Elith. This mound of the Elf Maid came to be an area much feared by the warbands of Morgoth, who would only tread upon it in great numbers, and even then suffer dire casualties at Turin's hand. In Doriath, however, word had long since reached the kingdom of the fall of Nargothrond. Many within the Girdle believed that Turin lay among the slain, but hesitated to investigate due to the presence of Glaurung within the halls of Felagund. This infuriated Morwen, who worried about her son's fate, whom she had entrusted to the elven king Thingol, who would not risk his people to uncover his current whereabouts. Despite the urging of Melian to not leave the Girdle, Morwen would not be stopped. Leaving Nienor with Doriath, she set out to find her son. Thingol would not have her dragged back to the kingdom, as it was not his way, so instead, a company of battle-hardened watchwardens with Mablung at their head was sent out to follow and protect the wife of Hurin. Once she reached the Sirion, a wide and swift river, Mablung had to reveal himself and offer his aid, as Morwen did not know how to cross. As the company began to cross at the Twillit Meris, another rider was spotted. Nienor had also left Doriath, unwilling to have others risk their lives while she remained safe. Despite an argument between mother and daughter, Nienor would not be swayed, and so she joined the expedition, seeking out the truth of Turin's fate and that of the kingdom of Nargothrond. When they finally reached the river Narog, Mablung led a company of a score of elves to ford the river. However, Glaurung was aware of their presence and drove off all but Mablung as he emerged from Nargothrond. The latter evaded detection by hiding under a rock and waiting for the dragon to pass over the rocky outcrop before fording the river. Unfortunately, the remaining 20 elves tasked with protecting Morwen and Nienor looked upon the dragon's might and bade their wards to mount and flee. An ill wind blew the vapors of the dragon across the fog-strewn plain, which drove the horses to madness, separating the company as they lost control of their mounts. In the chaos of the retreat, Nienor's horse stumbled, throwing her to the ground, and she decided then to return to the hill upon which they had initially been camped, hoping Mablung would return. Having reached the summit where the fog was at its thinnest, Nienor was surprised by the appearance of Glaurung, who immediately caught her gaze, allowing him to use his powers to bend her will to him. The dragon then besmirched her brother's name, claiming he was little more than a coward who abandoned the womenfolk to the orcs, and Nienor reacted with an outburst which revealed her identity. This caused Glaurung to laugh, and with the utmost cruelty of purpose, he took from the daughter of Hurin her memory as all grew dim to her, and she collapsed. Meanwhile, Mablung had explored the halls at length, and fearing the return of Glaurung, left the halls. During the crossing of Narog, he was spotted by the Great Drake. However, the power expended in breaking the will of a member of the House of Hador had left the dragon weary. Instead of killing Mablung outright, he bade him make his way to the hilltop to see what had become of his charge. Mablung made with all haste to the Amonethia as Glaurung returned to his horde. When the elf arrived, he found Nienor near comatose, but when he took her hand, she stirred and allowed him to lead her away from the hilltop. Left with little choice, Mablung brought Nienor eastwards, although she remained unresponsive and soon fell and lay still. Hope was returned to Mablung when 3 of the company came upon them and granted him aid. The journey was a slow one due to Nienor's condition. However, the farther they drew away from Nargothrond, the more strength returned to her. After many days of travel, they came to the western border of Doriath near Teiglin. Taking a rest before crossing into the Girdle, they were set upon by a band of orcs, and Nienor fled into the forest. Mablung was unable to find her despite his valiant efforts, and returned to Doriath with grief in his heart. He was absolved of all blame for the matter, as Melian stated, You did all that you could, and none other among the king's servants would have done so much. But by ill chance you were matched against a power too great for you, too great indeed for all that now dwell in Middle-earth." Despite this reassurance, the guilt of the loss of Morwen and Nienor remained a heavy burden, and for 3 years, Mablung ranged from the arid Wethrin to the mouths of Sirion fruitlessly in search of his charges. Following the orcish ambush of Mablung and his companions, Nienor had fled so far that she reached the burial mound of Finduilas. In a brutal storm, a company of the Men of Brethil, led by Tarambar, came upon her. While he initially believed her to be a wraith in the terrible conditions, Tarambar showed great kindness for the silent maiden, innately understanding that a terrible story lay behind her current malaise. She was then given the name Niniel, or Maid of Tears, and looked up and shook her head before repeating the name, which was the first word she had spoken since her encounter with Glaurung. The next day, she was brought to the Ethelbrandir. However, she fell under a severe fever on the journey, which required Brandir to utilize all his healing skills. She would sleep peacefully only when Tarambar sat by her side. In the period after her sickness, she was required to learn the art of speaking again, and she took to this with great intelligence and continued joy at her progress. At this time, Brandir fell madly in love with Niniel, but she viewed him as a brother, and it was to Tarambar that her heart was given, as they remained unaware that they were siblings. When she came to full health once more, much to the chagrin of Brandir, Tarambar asked for Niniel's hand in marriage, with the leader of the Men of Brethil counselling against the union due to the shadow which lay upon Tarambar. When Brandir revealed who Tarambar was and the fate of Nargothrond, Niniel hesitated, though when the spring came she agreed to marry him, and in the midsummer they were wed. Their joy was not to last, as Morgoth, tired of the defiance of the Men of Brethil, tasked Glaurung with bringing fire and death to the forests where they made their home. This left Tarambar in a dire predicament, as he remained uncertain whether his intervention would aid the stricken Men of Brethil or bring his doom to bear upon them. Initially, he did not ride out to face the orcs, as Ethelbrandir was not threatened. However, Dorlas and his warriors suffered in the early confrontations in the absence of their finest warrior. Dorlas returned from one such skirmish and showed his wounds to his friend, and Tarambar took up the black sword Gurthang once more, and drew to him a force of hundreds of woodsmen. With Tarambar at their head, they massacred the orcs and hung their bodies from the trees at the crossing of Teiglin. A second host was ambushed. Surprised by the wielder of Gurthang and the numbers of the woodsmen, they were annihilated, with only a tiny remnant returning with ill tidings to Nargothrond. Spring came, and with it the conception of Tarambar and Niniel's first child. However, once more, joy was to be stripped from them. News reached Ethelbrandir of the coming of Glaurung, who had begun to burn the forest down to draw out his great foe Tarambar. His progress was brutal in its efficiency, and before long, Glaurung had reached the Teiglin, which gave Tarambar an idea to slay the great beast. Taking with him Dorlas and a relative of Brandir, Hunthor, as the only men brave enough to face the dragon, Tarambar set out despite the protests of Niniel, and before long they came to the Nen Girith. Here Tarambar revealed his plan. Gauging Glaurung's current path, he believed that Glaurung would have to pass over a gorge known as the Kabed Enaras due to its great size. Despite the misgivings of Dorlas as to the location upon which they wished to strike, the trio moved at dusk to face one of the mightiest of all Morgoth's servants. In the meantime, Niniel, fearing for her husband and ignoring the counsel of Brandir, set out with a company of other concerned women to attain tidings of the encounter with the dragon. The lame Brandir, upon his crutch, followed in pursuit, well aware that the curse of Morgoth would bring nothing but despair to his beloved, and hoping he could potentially avert such a disaster. Tarambar and his companions soon came to Kabed Enaras, and the incredible noise of the river Teiglin disguised their movements, such that even the keen ears of Glaurung could not pick them out. During the initial phase of the climb, towards a position that would give them the best chance of felling Glaurung. Dorlas's courage failed, leaving Tarambar and Hunthor to complete their task. As they continued their crossing, the reek of the dragon was as such to make the two men dizzy, causing them to slip, only barely clinging to the tree stems. At the top, they waited for Glaurung to arrive and lodge himself in a favourable position during his crossing. Even the dragon's movement was brutal and violent, and had the duo been any closer, the burst of flame he let out would have slain them. Yet they survived, and quickly began to clamber along the cliffside to reach the dragon. The ever-fearless Tarambar hastened towards his foe, and in the process slipped, only to be saved by Hunthor. As he began to thank his companion, a great rock fell upon his head, and his corpse tumbled into the Teiglin. Tarambar rued the curse which lay upon him and had slain such a brave man, yet he steeled himself for what lay ahead. Drawing to him all his courage and hatred for the dragon, Tarambar was imbued with great strength and swiftly moved to the optimal point. He did so just in time for the dragon's underbelly to drop downwards into the gorge as he dragged his great weight across it. Turin then drew his sword and thrust it to the hilt into Glaurung's gut. The scream Glaurung let out shook the entire forest, and the thrashing which accompanied his final moments threw Tarambar loose. And if not for his strength of will, he would have also been slain. Tarambar once more braved the crossing, made his way to his dying foe, and looked upon him devoid of pity. He then walked forward and spoke freely of his hatred for the dragon, before drawing Gurthang from his gut. With this, a spurt of black blood shot forth, severely burning his arm. The cries he let out then caused the dragon to stir, and when Glaurung made eye contact, it was with such incomparable malice that Tarambar felt he had been struck by an arrow and fell as one who had died. Niniel soon came upon the scene, with Brandir following her far behind, and went straight to her beloved despite her fear of the stricken dragon. His appearance left little doubt in her mind as to his fate, and despite hearing a faint breath, she believed that Tarambar now lay dead, and so she began to cry and weep. Brandir arrived at the scene too late, as the cries of Niniel had roused the dying dragon, and with his dying words, he revealed her true identity. The dragon's death removed the spell he had cast upon her, and as a stunned Brandir watched on, Niniel bade her brother farewell, now realizing the truth of their incestuous union. Farewell, O twice beloved, Aturin Tarambar Turun Ambatanan, master of doom by doom mastered, O happy to be dead. She then began to run, despite the cries of Brandir, and made her way to the Kabed en Arras, and here she cast herself into the Teiglin, and died with an all-consuming grief in her heart. The gorge would be renamed the Kabed na Ermath, or the Leap of Dreadful Doom. However, this was not the end of that day's woes. Brandir returned to his people, and on the journey he came upon Dorlas, who was still ashamed of his failure to follow Turin through the gorge. Brandir acknowledged his cowardice, berating his lesser, and as a result enraged the warrior, who, as he looked set to strike the leader of his people, was struck down with the short sword of Brandir. Disgusted by the bloodshed, Brandir dropped the blood-soaked blade to the forest floor and continued back to his people. Once more amongst their company, he would bring the ill news of the day to them, before stating that the forest would no longer be known as Brethil, but rather Sachniachin Hurin, or the grave of the children of Hurin. Unbeknownst to them, Turin yet lived, and with the death of Glaurung, he had begun to stir as the dragon's power faded. Weary beyond all measure, he was forced to use Gurthang as a crutch, and came to the Nen Girith, where he met those who were readying to collect his corpse. Brandir then told Turin of the death of his beloved, and although he would not believe it at first, his anger at Brandir and accusations that he now lied drove the latter to reveal Niniel's true identity. Then a great rage overtook Turin, and he drew Gurthang from its sheath. Brandir, unarmed as he was, did not allow fear to overtake him and didn't flee, allowing the black sword to kill him. Those who witnessed the slaying fled from Turin in fear, and he was left alone. causing him to wander mad with grief through the forest, trying to convince himself that his sister still resided within Doriath. This illusion came crashing down around Turin as 12 elvish huntsmen, with Mablung at their head, came across the weariest of warriors within Beleriand. The tidings that Morwen and Nienor had left the girdle in search of Turin shattered what strands of willpower remained to him, and in his grief he cursed Doriath before fleeing from the huntsmen. Mablung ordered that they follow him, but Turin outran his pursuers with ease, and came to the Cabed Naeramath. Here he was unwilling to sully the waters in which his sister now lay, and instead drew Gurthang one final time. He said to his blade, "Hail, Gurthang, Iron of Death, thou alone now remainst. But what lord or loyalty dost thou know, save the hand that wieldeth thee? From no blood wilt thou shrink? Wilt thou take Turin to Rambar? Wilt thou slay me swiftly?" And the blade responded, "Yea, I will drink thy blood, that may I forget the blood of Beleg my master, and the blood of Brandir slain unjustly. I will slay thee swiftly." Turin placed the hilt on the ground and cast himself upon the black sword, ending his life. Too late did Mablung come upon his friend, and when the men of Brethiel came down from the Nen Girith, they told him of what occurred. In their sadness, the Edain began to weep, and Mablung, having learned of his great failure, and thinking back to the sacrifice of Hurin at the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, placed an all-encompassing weight of guilt upon himself. The dragon's remains were burnt in a great pyre, and Turin's body was placed upon the shoulders of his companions and burned within a high mound, with the shards of Gurthang beside him. A great grey headstone was brought some time after, and upon it were carved in the runes of Doriath the names Turin Tarambar Dagnir Glaurunga and Nienor Niniel. Having learned of the death of his children, Morgoth finally released Hurin from his bondage, and in his wandering, he came to the forest of Brethiel. Coming to the Cabed Naeramath, Hurin would not look upon the great stone, for he knew what was carved upon it even then. He had also noticed that he was not alone, for a fellow aged wanderer sat in the shadow of the headstone. Even when they drew back their hood and revealed a beaten-down visage, Hurin did not recognize the wanderer. However, the instant they locked eyes, he knew her to be his wife, Morwen Elethen, who informed him that she too was now spent and would pass with the setting of the sun. Hurin did not respond, and instead sat beside the stone with Morwen in his arms, and as the sun went down, she sighed and clasped his hand. Then she was still, and Hurin knew she had passed, leaving him alone and broken beneath the shade of the headstone of his children. Our chronicler concludes this story with these words: "Here ends the tale of the children of Hurin, longest of all the lays of Beleriand." Hurin had been released from Morgoth's prison in FA 500 following the death of his children Turin and Nienor under the pretense of Morgoth's pity, as the Dark Lord acknowledged that he had defeated one of his most defiant adversaries. However, as was always his way, the Dark Lord instead hoped that the woe which had befallen the children of Hurin would have poisoned the mind of his captive, and he would facilitate the creation of greater chaos and strife upon whichever path he would now tread, and in doing so, bring low those few who now resisted Morgoth following the Nunnerydd Annuidiad. Unfortunately for the Free Folk, not even Morgoth himself could have imagined the destruction to follow in Hurin's wake during the final years of his life. Hurin returned to Hithlum and his former home of Dolomin. He was to find a land much changed in his absence. The peoples who had once prospered under his wise rulership were kept beneath the cruel yoke of the Easterlings, led by Lorgan. The cruel overlords of this region initially did not recognize this tragic hero of a long-forgotten battle, and instead feared him, believing Hurin to be one of Morgoth's most trusted servants. Seeing now that the House of Hador lay in ruins, Hurin was forced to turn his back upon the land of his fathers, and he was to be joined by 7 outlaws in his journey south. The company made their way to the Vale of Sirion, where Hurin would abandon his companions and seek out his former lord, Turgon of Gondolin. After searching for an entrance to the city, Hurin soon began to despair, as King Turgon initially kept the entrance closed, as was the strategy which had kept the city hidden throughout the preceding years. This infuriated the aged warrior, whose weariness soon brought anger, as he cried out against Turgon and his hidden city. Unbeknownst to Húrin, this was to bring with it death and destruction of unquantifiable proportions, as he was being watched and had inadvertently revealed the city's general location to Morgoth's spies. Seeing now that he had been abandoned by the elf for whom he had sacrificed all, Húrin turned aside and left the area. Only too late then did Turgon send the eagles to bring Húrin within the Vale and the protection of Gondolin. From that day onwards, Morgoth was to set a vigil upon the region, in the hopes of finding a way to raze the last great bastion of defiance within Beleriand to the ground, all inspired by the woe and heartbreak which forever lay upon the House of Hador, almost akin to a funeral shroud. From here, Húrin made his way to Brethil, where he bore witness to the tombstone of his fallen children and the final moments of Morwen's life. This was the final straw for Húrin, who was now engulfed by an all-encompassing fury and sought to enact vengeance upon all those who had failed his offspring. The first group to feel his wrath would be the Haladin, who were now ruled by Hardaing, who detested the House of Hador due to the petty rivalries present among the Edain in these days. Therefore, upon Húrin's arrival, Hardaing assaulted him, yet even in Húrin's advanced age, he remained a potent warrior and could easily injure Hardaing. However, Húrin was taken captive and set to be tried for his crimes at the 301st Folkmoot of Judgment. The crimes he was charged with included the wounding of Hardaing, ungrateful and discourteous conduct towards the guards who had found him in Halthen Aleth, and entering Brethil to slay Hardaing at the behest of the Lord of Angband. However, Manthor, the captain of the guard and master of the North March, who had befriended Húrin following his discovery at the Halthen Aleth and during his imprisonment, would speak on Húrin's side. Therefore Hardaing, who sat upon the Angbor or Doom Rock alongside his lieutenant Avrank, would argue at length with Manthor and Húrin, with the opinion of the Haladin swaying between both sides as the trial continued. Manthor conducted an eloquent defense on Húrin's behalf, culminating in the accused's heartfelt testimony. He would speak of the deaths of his wife and children having drawn him to the grave and brought half of those gathered to his side. The trial results were to bring further bloodshed to the Forest of Brethil, as a civil war of sorts among the Haladin erupted. The Hall of the Haladin was razed to the ground, with Hardaing and Avrank barely emerging from the flames with their lives, only for the fleeing chieftain to be struck down by a spear lodged firmly between his shoulder blades. With his death ended the line of Haldad, and most of the survivors were to follow Húrin, who now led them towards the ruins of Nargothrond, seemingly abandoned following the death of Glaurung. However, unbeknownst to those who had made their way to the desolate shell of a once mighty elven kingdom, the halls of Nargothrond had not been entirely abandoned. For now, the caves were occupied by Mim, the petty dwarf, as he had claimed the great hoard of Glaurung following the dragon's death at Turin's hand. Húrin, facing the dwarf who had caused much misfortune to his offspring, was filled with great anger. The father of Turin then asked the dwarf to reveal his identity in order to confirm the subject of his anger, and this exchange was to seal the doom of the last of the petty dwarfs. "I am Mim, and before the proud ones came from over the sea, dwarves delved the halls of Nulakhistin. I have but returned to take what is mine, for I am the last of my people." "Then you shall enjoy your inheritance no longer," said Húrin. "For I am Húrin, son of Galdor, returned out of Angband, and my son was Turin Turambar, whom you have not forgotten. And he it was that slew Glaurung the dragon, who wasted these halls where you now sit, and not unknown is it to me by whom the dragon helm of Dor-lómin was betrayed." Húrin, entirely overcome with rage and wrath of an insurmountable nature, ignored the desperate pleas of the petty dwarf and slew Mim before the gates of Nargothrond. This drew from Mim a final curse that the dragon horde would bring naught else but woe and misfortune to those who would take possession of it. With Mim's passing, the last of the petty dwarves of Middle-earth went extinct, ending these exiled cousins of Durin's folk for good and all. The details as to who slew the dwarf, the nature of the horde, and the size of the group of outlaws vary in the retelling. Yet the most crucial detail remains. Húrin's band would take the now cursed dragon horde from the halls. The curse upon the horde would soon drive the Haladin who accompanied Húrin mad, and they quickly turned upon one another, with many of them slain on the journey through petty squabbles over the division of the wealth of Nargothrond. The broken Húrin cared little for the wealth he now possessed, and continued on a direct course toward those he blamed most for his family's suffering. The former wielder of the dragon helm of Dor-lómin came to the girdle of Melian and sought to enter into Doriath to ensure that Thingol was made aware of his failure as a ward to his wife and children. Húrin was found by the border guards of Doriath, who barely recognized this grim and aged warrior, yet they brought him still to their lord within the Thousand Caves. Thingol likewise struggled to recognize Húrin, the man who had once stood at the forefront of what it meant to be of the Edain in the days before all hope had been lost in the struggle against Morgoth. However, the realization of the man who now presented himself to the King of Doriath brought an insurmountable immensity of grief and regret to Thingol. Despite his best efforts, he had failed the House of Hador and allowed its destruction to occur under his stewardship. Thingol's greeting was filled with the respect which should be duly accorded to one of the Edain's finest, returned from years of torture wrought upon him for his efforts against the Dark Lord. Yet Húrin remained silent and reached within his tattered, dirty cloak to bring forth the greatest treasure of the now cursed horde of Nargothrond, for he presented to the King of Doriath the Nauglamir. This dwarven-forged necklace had been presented to Finrod Felagund many years prior. Its majesty was clear to all those gathered, yet the intent behind the gifting of such a fine piece of jewellery was only matched by the vile curse which lay upon it due to Mim's final words. Húrin handed the necklace over to the man who had once taken his children as wards and seen to the safety of his much-beloved wife by casting it at the king's feet. "Receive thou thy fee," he cried, "for thy fair keeping of my children and my wife." Thingol's gaze was then cast upon the jewel, which now lay upon the floor of the Thousand Caves, and although he understood the gravity of the item presented to him, he also understood the intent behind such a gift. Thingol displayed a great degree of pity, and restrained the anger which would ordinarily have accompanied such a demeaning act committed by Húrin against one of the great elven kings. Before the situation could be further escalated through the scorn which had at this point overtaken the father of Turin, Melian, in her great wisdom, spoke. "Húrin Thalion, Morgoth hath bewitched thee. For he that seeth through Morgoth's eyes, willing or unwilling, seeth all things crooked. Long was Turin thy son fostered in the halls of Menegroth, and shown love and honour as the son of the king. And it was not by the king's will nor by mine that he never came back to Doriath. And afterwards thy wife and thy daughter were harboured here with honour and goodwill, and we sought by all means that we might dissuade Morwen from the road to Nargothrond. With the voice of Morgoth thou dost now upbraid thy friends." At this, Morgoth's curse upon the House of Hador since the Nernaeth Anoediad and the devastation of the Union of Maethros was broken for good and all. Húrin realized that the weight he carried for years prior should have, by all rights, lay at the feet of the Dark Lord himself. However, the former bearer of the Dragon Helm now knew that he had allowed the trials and tribulations of his recent history to taint and destroy all those he had come into contact with since the passing of his wife. Therefore, as he stared long and hard into the eyes of the Queen of Doriath and protected from the vile tendrils of Morgoth within her girdle, he stooped low and picked up the Nauglamir before handing it to Thingol, stating, "Receive now, Lord, the necklace of the dwarfs, as a gift from one who has nothing, as a memorial of Húrin of Dor-lómin, for my fate is fulfilled, and the purpose of Morgoth achieved, but I am his thrall no longer." Following this final candid interaction with the King of Doriath, Húrin turned his back on the Thousand Caves and never returned to the girdle. None stood willing to stop him, or even ask where he intended to go, for the weight of woe upon his shoulders was one none of the kingdom could bear. Nor did any of the people of Doriath take note where Húrin was now headed. This was to have devastating consequences, as Húrin, now devoid of purpose and desire to continue his existence in the absence of his wife and children, found himself in despair. In this lowest moment, the patriarch of the House of Hador decided upon his final course. Rather than bring further suffering upon those he encountered, Húrin cast himself into the Western Sea and ended the life of the mightiest warrior of the Edain. Yet despite his efforts, his final actions, influenced by Morgoth's vile taint, were to have devastating consequences for the Kingdom of Doriath, which had welcomed his kin with open arms. Thingol gazed upon the Nauglamir, and his thoughts were drawn towards the Silmaril that Beren and Luthien had brought to his kingdom. For in these days, the dwarves still made their way from Nogrod in great companies through the Kingdom of Doriath, and thought was hatched within Thingol's mind that the Silmaril could be attached to the Nauglamir. While the lust of the dwarfs was initially brought to the forefront of their thoughts by the combined view of the Nauglamir and Silmaril, they initially agreed to the works. Yet such lust amongst the dwarfs was only ever temporarily satiated. During the painstaking process, Thingol sat in silence among the smithies of Menegroth, increasingly affected by the Horde's curse, and allowed no other elf to witness the works of the dwarfs. In time the work was completed, and the reforged Nauglamir's beauty became incomparable in its splendour. Upon its completion, the King of Doriath stepped forward to claim for himself the finest accomplishment of his reign. The dwarves, however, refused the king the item they had been forging, presuming that it rightly belonged to the dwarves, as the original creators of the Nauglamir. Thingol would not accept this, believing it to be naught more than a ruse by the dwarves to claim for themselves the Silmaril, which had been won at great cost by the valiant efforts of the man Beren and elf Luthien. His words were full of outrage. "How do ye of uncouth race dare to demand aught of me, Elu Thingol, Lord of Beleriand, whose life began by the waters of Cuivenan years uncounted ere the fathers of the stunted people awoke?" Thingol stood amongst them proud and tall, yet this pride would prove to be the undoing of his reign and kingdom, for his comments had stoked the embers of dwarven lust into a full-blown rage. So it was that noble King Thingol was slain by the dwarven smiths within the very darkest depths of Menegroth. His last sight, before he passed on, was the Silmaril, now prominently displayed within the Nauglamir. The dwarven companies of those days were well armed and armoured, yet deep within Doriath they were left with no choice but to flee eastwards. However, the elves, enraged by the murder of their king, would not allow such a crime to be left unavenged, and hunted the dwarfs, slaying them at will, until the Nauglamir had been recovered and returned to the heartbroken Queen Melian. Unfortunately for the denizens of Doriath, two of the dwarves who had participated in the murder of Thingol had survived the pursuit and made their way to Nogrod. Here they detailed what they deemed to be an affront to their people, and the leaders of the city lamented the death of their smiths to such an extent that they were driven to rage. Thoughts of vengeance were brought to the forefront of their minds, and although the sister city of Belegost refused them aid and counselled against violence, the die had already been cast. A great host emerged from the city and headed with all haste westwards over Gelion towards Doriath. The death of her beloved husband Thingol had also impacted Melian so drastically that the girdle that had long kept the kingdom safe failed. Melian spoke only to Marchwarden Mablung and bade him to seek out Beren and Luthien before she finally passed across the Westward Sea, returning to the land of the Valar. In the absence of Melian, the leaderless elves of Doriath were left unprepared as the Naugrim, as the elves called the dwarfs, crossed over the Aros and fell upon their hated foes. The ferocity and anger of the dwarfs of Nogrod were such that they swept aside the purposeless and despairing Grey Elves with ease. Before long, the dwarves crossed the Great Bridge and made their way to Menegroth, where the Battle of the Thousand Caves was to ensue. A great many elves and dwarves were slain in this battle, foremost among them Mablung, who was laid low before the very doors of the treasury which housed the Nauglamir. With the death of the foremost captain of Doriath, Menegroth was then sacked with wild abandon, and the Nauglamir with its Silmaril was taken by the Naugrim. Word of the sack soon reached Beren and Luthien, who now dwelt upon the Green Isle of Tol Galen alongside their son, Dior Eluchil. Upon hearing of the fall of Menegroth, Beren, with his son in tow, headed north to the river Askar, accompanied by a great number of green elves of Assyriand. This company proceeded to ambush the returning dwarves in what came to be known as the Battle of Sarnathrad. The dwarves, laden with the spoils of war, began their ascent of the Gellion, only to be met with the blaring of elven war horns and innumerable arrows feathering the convoy. A vast number of the dwarves were slain in the early onslaught, with only a scant few escaping towards Mount Dulmed. However, they would find no respite upon its slopes, as the shepherds of the forest, the Ents, came against them with force, once more driving the host towards the woods of Eret Lindon. From there, none of the Naugrim would ever emerge, as the great sack of Menegroth was avenged, and the Nauglamir, with its Silmaril, recovered. Beren recovered this trinket in what was to be his last battle, for he was the one who slew the very Lord of Nogrod and reclaimed the Nauglamir. However, with his final breath, the dying dwarf laid a further curse upon the cause of the conflict, which Beren did not heed, it would seem. Following the battle, Dior Eluchil bade farewell to his parents, and with his wife Nimloth and their children, Elored, Elorin and Elwing, moved to Doriath, taking up the throne of his grandfather. The successor of Thingol would proceed to uplift his downtrodden people and restore the halls of Menegroth and the might of Doriath. However, this was not to last. For with the dying days of summer on a brisk autumn night, a messenger came and knocked upon the doors of the great hall in Menegroth, demanding an audience with King Dior. The messenger revealed himself to be one of the lords of the Green Elves, who had made with all haste from Assyriand, which provided a clue into the dire nature of the news to come. The door wards admitted him to the great hall, where the king sat alone, and, unwilling to break the deafening silence, the Green Lord handed a coffer to Dior and left wordlessly. Within the coffer lay the Nauglamir, which had graced the visage of Luthien up until this point, which broke the king's heart. Therefore, upon opening the coffer, Dior was made aware that Beren Achemion and Luthien Tinuviel had died their second and final death, leaving Arda to go to a fate known only by the race of man beyond this world. In his unknowable grief, the young king gazed long and hard upon the Silmaril. This mighty jewel represented for his people the triumph of hope over despair, through the ceaseless efforts of Beren and Luthien to overcome the terror wrought by Morgoth. In the years since, it has been theorized and accepted among the wisest of Middle-earth, the Silmaril hastened their end. As the flame and beauty embodied by Luthien when she wore the Nauglamir were such that it should not have existed in mortal lands, its brightness, in the end, bringing a final darkened day to the tale of Beren Achemion and Luthien Tinuviel. Unaware of this fact, Dior repeated his parents' mistake and clasped upon his neck the Nauglamir. In doing so, he became the fairest of all the children of the world he inhabited, with none of the Edain, the Eldar, or the Maiar of the Blessed Realm capable of matching his majesty and grace. However, this was not the end of the misfortune which would befall Dior Eluchil and his people, for rumours of the king's splendour now raced across Beleriand. As many stated, a Silmaril of Feanor burns again in the woods of Doriath. The rumour was to have devastating consequences for the kingdom, which had barely survived the earlier sacking of Menegroth, as it drew upon the king the ire invoked by the Oath of Feanor. While Luthien bore the Nauglamir, it was not an issue, for none among the Eldar nor the Naugrim were willing to assail such a beloved figure. However, as word reached the surviving sons of Feanor of the renewal of Doriath and the pride of its monarch, the seven came together once more after years of wandering and set upon a single course of action: the recovery of their father's masterwork from the resurgent kingdom of Doriath at any cost. The issue was initially raised somewhat amicably, at least by the standards of the descendants of Feanor, as they sent messengers demanding the return of the Silmaril. However, in his pride, Dior returned no answer, which provided the only pretext the warlike Celegorm required, given the circumstances. Enraged to be rebuffed in such a manner, Celegorm riled his brothers to such an extent that they agreed upon his preferred course of action, a direct assault on the kingdom, which now lay bereft of the protection afforded by the Girdle of Melian. So began the second kinslaying. The assault was launched in the darkest depths of a harsh winter. The brothers fell upon Menegroth, catching the defenders unaware, with the element of surprise proving the deciding factor in this instance. Cutting down the guardsmen, the great sons of Feanor fought with Dior within the Thousand Caves. Dior displayed all of his father's martial prowess, combined with the gifts inherent within all of the race of Eldar, making him a formidable foe even to the sons of Feanor. He fought as one possessed, and struck down Celegorm with his own hand, with Curufin and Caranthia likewise finding their final ends within the Thousand Caves. However, this supernatural effort to hold back the enraged sons of Feanor was unsustainable. At the conflict's end, Dior and his beloved wife Nimloth lay slain. The servants of Celegorm displayed the cruelty of their fallen master even in his absence, and seized Dior's young sons and left them in the depths of the forest to starve. Having fulfilled his oath to a certain extent, Maethros was somewhat freed from his father's power over him. As such, he repented in the face of his comrades' actions and attempted to save the children. Long did he search for them within the forest, yet to no avail, and the fates of Elured and Elurin remain unknown. Doriath was left a smouldering ruin, never to rise again. Yet in their brutality and malice, the sons of Feanor could not attain what they had long sought. A number of the residents of Doriath, Elwing among them, had survived the onslaught directed by Celegorm. With this small remnant of Dior's people went the Silmaril, and they soon arrived at the mouth of the river Sirion by sea. With the fall of Doriath for good and all, only a single realm of great enough size to prove a threat to the Dark Lord and his forces remained. Gondolin, hidden within its great valley, yet stood, with its very existence in such dark days, an act of defiance. Yet Hurin's actions had forever imperiled this mighty bastion of hope amidst an overwhelming tide of despair, a tide which was soon to wash over the free peoples. To continue our tale, we need to go back a bit to the time before the fall of Doriath in the second kinslaying in the year 506. Our tale begins with the forebear of Tuor, Huor, son of Galdor and brother of Hurin, who, in their younger years in FA 458, campaigned against the Orcs as members of a war party. However, the two brothers were cut off from the rest of the warriors of their company within the Vale of Sirion. If not for the intervention of the Vala Ulmo, the brothers would have been slain. However, he did intervene, and a great mist arose, allowing them to escape into the then abandoned region of Dimbar. From here, a pair of great eagles picked the brothers up and brought them within the depths of the hidden vale to Gondolin, where King Turgon welcomed them. For Turgon still remembered the great prophecy set out by Ulmo, that the hidden city would be aided by the House of Hador, and the king asked the brothers to stay. However, they would not be separated from their kinsmen for long, and with a heavy heart, Turgon allowed the eagles to return the brothers to Dor-lómin, on the basis that they swear an oath to keep the city's location a secret. Around FA 470, Huor was wed to Rian, a daughter of one of the other great houses of the Edain, Beor, and the pair soon conceived a son. Huor named the child Tuor even before his birth. He would never get to meet his firstborn, for a great muster had been called by the High King Fingon, and Huor left Dor-lómin for the final time. During the Nernaeth Anoediad, Huor met Turgon once more during the battle. However, the joy of this reunion was short-lived, as the battle soon turned against the Union of Maethros. In his final act, Huor stood side by side with his brother Hurin in a desperate rearguard action which saved the Gondolindrim host. Unfortunately, a poison arrow struck Huor in the eye, ending his life in an instant. Word of Morgoth's triumph was not long in reaching Dor-lómin, and Rian despaired as she heard nothing of her husband's ultimate fate. And so she ventured forth to find him while still pregnant with Tuor. Alone in the great wilds of northern Beleriand, she would have perished with her unborn child if not for the intervention of the Grey Elves who dwelt in the mountains to the west of Lake Mithrim. Within their domain, Tuor was born in FA 472. However, Rian could not stay and offered her farewell. "Let him be called Tuor, for that name his father chose ere war came between us. And I beg of you to foster him and to keep him hidden in your care, for I forebode that great good for elves and men shall come from him. But I must go in search of Huor, my lord." Before she could leave, the only Grey Elf who had answered Fingon's call, Anael, returned, bringing the news of the defeat. Huor had fallen by his brother Hurin and lay among the piles of the slain, which now blighted the Half Enendengin. Rian was heartbroken and went to find her slain husband, wherein she met her end upon the waste of the Anfalglyph. This left Tuor within the care of the Grey Elves. When he came into the fullness of his manhood, he embodied much of the great strength and valor of his cousin Hurin, without the dark cloud of despair which blighted all of his days in Beleriand. By this point, the situation in the north was becoming untenable. The Easterlings, betrayed by their Dark Lord and given naught more than the poor soil of Hithlum for their reward, began to take their frustrations out on the denizens of this region. At 16 years of age, Tuor was already a capable warrior and wished to make war upon these usurpers. However, Anael rejected such foolhardy notions. Instead, he would take his people south through the Anonin Gelith, or Gate of the Noldor, to lands in which those in his care would be free from the tremendous reach of the Dark Lord, if only for a time. Unfortunately for Tuor and the Grey Elves, their residence in the caves of Androth had been watched by the servants of the Dark Lord, and the Easterlings tracked their march south. Not long after leaving the caves, the elves were assaulted by a mighty force of orcs and Easterlings, causing the company to scatter and flee. Yet despite his elven upbringing, the blood of the House of Hador flowed freely through Tuor's veins, and long did he stand his ground, slaying a great many of his foes. But even a warrior of Tuor's strength could not hold back such a tide forever, and the Ward of the Grey Elves was eventually captured and brought before Lorgan, the chief of the Easterlings, who decreed that he would hold the boy as a slave. For 3 years, Tuor endured the thraldom of Lorgan, who treated him worse than any other due to his noble birth, to break the young man and destroy the pride of the House of Hador, whose lands he had usurped. Tuor endured in the face of Lorgan's cruelty and grew even larger and stronger, yet most importantly, he was swifter now than any among the Easterlings. Therefore, when he was sent one day on an errand within the great forests of Hithlum, he turned on his captors and slew them with the axe he had been given to complete the task. From here he fled, yet Lorgan would not allow his thrall to escape so easily, and sent men and hounds after him. This proved fruitless, as during his captivity, Tuor had shown kindness to the hounds of the house, and when they came upon him, they would display naught but affection for him, until Tuor commanded them to return to their master. Tuor would make a home of sorts in the caves of Androth, and for 4 long years wreak havoc and devastation upon the Easterlings in the land of his fathers, slaying many of his would-be captors. However, he did not seek vengeance, and instead sought out the Gate of the Noldor so he could escape Hithlum, aware that the life of an outlaw did not lend itself to a long life. Ulmo once more intervened, and such intervention inspired Tuor to not tarry any longer, and to instead make with all haste for the gate, even though he had long been unable to come across it in his travels. For 3 days, Tuor followed the signs set out by Ulmo, and on the morning of the 4th day, he came across 2 elves, Gelmir and Amenas of Finarfin's people. The elves then led Tuor out of Hithlum with Gelmir stating, "Through darkness one may come to light." Having brought Tuor from the darkness of Hithlum, the Noldor bade him farewell, and Tuor continued his journey southwards, whereby he came to Fëanor's landing point in Beleriand in the echoing mountains of Lamoth, about the Firth of Drengist. Tuor would then become the first member of the Edain to set his eyes upon the Great Sea, having followed the calls of the gulls, which had long been beloved of the Teleri elves. For the gulls had led him to the very shores of the great sea Beligea the Shoreless, having passed beyond the borders of Nevrast. This awakened in Tuor a longing for adventures of a maritime nature which would never leave him, even as the days of Beleriand grew short and Morgoth's victory seemed inevitable. Tuor tarried a while in Nevrast, seeing that it was safe from the vile machinations of Morgoth, which even now brought ruin and despair to the free peoples through the curse placed upon the children of his uncle Húrin. Yet as this darkness spread ever further to the south, and the dying days of Nargothrond were soon to come to pass, the birds seemed to anticipate what was to be. For Tuor's peaceful existence in Nevrast was interrupted by the sound of great wings, as he witnessed 7 great swans flying in a wedge formation southwards. They wheeled about and plunged into the waters nearby as they began to pass over the Edine's head. Tuor greeted them, and before long they had set upon their journey once more, and so the man of Dor-lómin now knew that he had tarried too long in Nevrast and followed their formation southwards. He would travel for 7 days before he came upon Mount Taris and the grand remnants of what was once the abode of Turgon, the halls of Vinyamar. The swans decided his path once more, for they had corrected their course and perched upon the highest terrace of the halls above the western door. Tuor entered through this door and was awestruck by the finely wrought halls, and even more so by the armour left behind the throne. The hauberk gleamed a great silver, untarnished by the decay of time. The shield was long and tapering in an odd design. However, its field was blue, and upon it lay the emblem of a white swan's wing. Tuor accepted this elven-wrought finery, while issuing forth a challenge which would alter his fate forever. By this token I will take these arms unto myself, and upon myself whatsoever doom they bear. Tuor would then array himself in the armour, taking with it the blade and great shield, before exiting the hall a changed man. This change was noticed even by the swans who had acted as his guide until this point, for each of them proffered a feather, and Tuor graciously decorated his helm with these 7 gleaming white feathers. The swans then left their perch and flew northwards, never to be seen again. Yet Tuor's feet now guided him as he felt compelled to head to the shore. Here, Ulmo revealed himself to Tuor, making Huor's son the only man ever to be approached directly by a member of the Valar. Ulmo would then task Tuor with reaching Gondolin and warning Turgon of what was to come. As a parting gift, he gave to the Edain he favoured above all a great cloak, which would keep the eyes of the enemy from his path, and in doing so, ensure the secrecy of Gondolin was maintained. Ulmo then called upon a great storm, and Tuor sought refuge in the hall. As he awoke the next day, he came across an elf who had survived the storm, and the shipwreck which had brought him to the halls of Vinyamar. Tuor therefore made the acquaintance of Voronwi of the Noldor, and although he initially refused to bring Tuor to the gates of Gondolin, the word of Ulmo's task changed the elf's mind. Voronwi led his young companion westwards, up the steep slopes of the terrace, and down into the northern region of Fallas. From here, they then headed eastwards, to the eaves of the Eret Wethrin, where they rested and hid for a time from the roaming bands of orcs in the region. However, the cloak of Ulmo lay upon Tuor, and he questioned not the path decided upon by Voronwi as they continued ever eastwards towards Gondolin. The pair soon came to the pools of Ivrin, where they dwelt for a time. Here Voronwi despaired as to the devastation wrought by Glaurung during the destruction of Nargothrond. Yet they were soon startled by the cries which could be heard within the surrounding woods. For a tall man clad in black, his face grief-stricken, and his blade black as midnight emerged, crying out, "Ivrin, Faelivrin, Gwyndor and Beleg, here once I was healed, but now never shall I drink the draught of peace again." Yet he did not tarry long, and quickly made for the north, and in this chance meeting the destinies of Tuor and Turin forever diverged, and no greater contrast can be drawn than that of Tale's End for these scions of the House of Hador. Their journey was to continue, as the pair endured the trials of their journey. Fortunately, however, this did not involve any one-sided encounters with the orcs, which now wandered freely through these lands. Tireless in their pursuit, and desperate to reach their destination with naught more than suffering and orcish warbands behind them, Tuor and Voronoi eventually came to the guarded gate of Gondolin. However, as Voronoi had predicted, the Gondolidrim, in order to preserve their very existence, stuck to the laws of their people, with an obedience which bordered on cruelty to those who dwelt outside the valley. Despite Voronoi's previous residence within the hidden city, the pair were taken prisoner and brought to the Warden of the Great Gate, who would decide upon their fates and the allowance of their entry into the city. The captain of the Dark Guard, Alemekil, decided to bring Tuor and Voronoi to the Warden to deliberate upon their fates. The pair was first marched through the Gate of Wood and informed that no stranger could go back through a gate they had passed. The company of three continued a half-league before coming to the second gate, the Gate of Stone. The Gate of Bronze followed this, and eventually the fourth gate, the Gate of Rithon Iron, which was the most imposing fortification in all of Beleriand, rivaled only by the very gates of Angband. Passing through the unflinching and formidable Iron Guard, the fifth gate, the Gate of Silver, followed, and at last, the final ancient gate of Turgon, the Golden Gate, lay before the company. Alemekil ensured their entrance by dint of the status he maintained among the guard, yet Tuor was struck by just how formidable the fortifications and the guards who manned the gates were. However, he still bore the warning of Ulmo close to his heart, and endeavoured to ensure that Turgon was made aware of the doom which lay at the journey's end for the Gondolindrim. Alemekil led Tuor and Voronoi the short distance to the seventh gate, the Gate of Steel, which Maeglin had reeked after the Nunaeth Enoidiad to cover the span of the wide entrance to the Orfalch Echor. Alemekil strode forward to the great towers of the final gate and struck a bar, which caused a noise reminiscent of a harp to ring out. Riders issued forth at this call, yet at the forefront, far ahead of his compatriots, came a rider upon a magnificent white steed. The elf who approached the trio dismounted with incomparable grace and elegance, which left Tuor and Voronoi in awe of a being of such regal majesty. For Ecthelion, Lord of the Fountains and Warden of the Great Gate, had come forth, a mighty warrior among the highest echelons of the Eldar race of the First Age, and one for whom his mere presence demanded respect and deference. His mail was of gleaming silver. Upon his head lay a majestic helm, complete with a spike, with which was the adornment of a beautiful diamond at its point, and most imposing of all was his shield, which shimmered with the beauty of 1,000 studs of crystal. Alemekil introduced the Warden to his charges, and at once Ecthelion turned his noble visage upon the stranger in their midst. The very essence of fate hung upon Tuor as a mist, which enlarged his presence to such a degree that his stature seemed to be even greater than that of the Lord of the Fountains himself. Ecthelion was wed to his duty, and duly informed Tuor that he would never leave the valley once he entered, as was the dictate of the law of his people. You have come to the last gate. Know then that no stranger who passes it shall ever go out again, save by the door of death. Tuor was undaunted by what was naught more than a thinly veiled threat, and with his head held high, responded, "Speak not ill-boding. If the messenger of the Lord of Waters go by that door, then all those who dwell here will follow him. Lord of the Fountains, hinder not the message of the Lord of Waters." Those gathered, Ecthelion amongst them, were left bewildered, for the weight of the words which Tuor had uttered seemed otherworldly in their impact upon the elves. Voronoi in particular felt that the words of Tuor came from far away in a voice of such grandeur that they carried upon the mountains and valleys to sway the Warden of the Great Gate and his retinue. Yet Tuor was left entirely unaware of the power with which his words now carried, and believed they had merely come from his own lips. However, Ulmo himself, it would seem, would not let his favoured people fall within the grasp of Morgoth while he had the power to sway events, and at that very moment the fate of Gondolin hung upon a knife's edge. Ecthelion was silent for a long time, yet as the silence hung upon those gathered outside the final gate, his awe for the man of the House of Hador who stood before him and the tidings he brought with him grew exponentially. Wordlessly, the Warden of the Great Gate bowed to Tuor, turned and placed his hands upon the gate, and it opened inwardly, confirming that the son of Huor was now to live amongst the Gondolindrim for the years to come. Tuor stepped through the Great Gate of Iron onto a high plateau which looked out across a valley. Deep within this valley were the gleaming white towers of Gondolin, framed by white snow. Tuor, raised in the far north, was left speechless by the view of the hidden city and stood dumbfounded for a long time as he gazed upon Turgon's domain. Yet as this silent vigil continued, the cloak which had hidden Tuor from the numerous servants of the Dark Lord throughout his travels was torn from his shoulders by the mighty winds of the high plateau. In this seemingly insignificant act of the wind, the livery of Nevrast was revealed, and those gathered were awestruck, as long ago did they remember that their king had left these garments behind the high seat of Vinyamar. With this was Ecthelion finally swayed towards the total acceptance of the stranger who had come unbidden to his gate, declaring, "Now no further proof is needed, and even the name he claims as son of Huor matters less than this clear proof that he comes from Ulmo himself." Tuor was then led to King Turgon to present before the leader of the last great free city of Beleriand the warning of Ulmo. A great crowd of elves came to the audience to gaze upon one of the only strangers to have ever been welcomed to the city. Although the city was a marvel in and of itself, none of the architecture of the Gondolindrim could match the beauty of the palace in which Turgon dwelt. For at either side of the door of this vast structure were the great trees Glingol and Bansil, one of gold and the other silver, the great offshoots of the trees of Valinor before the devastation of Morgoth and Ungoliant had been wrought upon the Undying Land. Turgon strode forth, clad in white, and welcomed the weary and well-travelled youth to his hidden city. Once more, Ulmo granted great power to the voice of Tuor, as he bore with him the warning of the Valar. However, Turgon's pride in the city's defences, roused by the Council of Maeglin, as well as his certainty as to the hidden nature of Gondolin, ensured that he could not be swayed. Tuor and Voronoi were distraught by the callous dismissal of such a warning, particularly after the trials and tribulations of their journey. They now despaired as to where their future lay. Turgon, despite his pride, remained an honourable and wise leader of the elves, and after some deliberation, bade the pair to remain within the valley. Our chronicler does not detail the entirety of Tuor's stay within the realm of Gondolin. However, it is noted that on many occasions, Tuor was tested, wishing to return to the forest and listen to the call of Ulmo to return to the sea. Yet he remained, for he bore a great love for one amongst the Gondolindrim, the daughter of King Turgon, Idril Celebrimbor. Initially, such a pairing would have seemed unfathomable in the eyes of the king and his citizens. However, after many years in Gondolin, Tuor had risen to become one of the foremost members of the Gondolindrim, for he had embraced his place within the Hidden Valley and accepted instruction from Voronoi and several other prominent members of the city. In doing so, Tuor's physical and spiritual stature was greatly enhanced in such a manner which supplemented the blessings which Ulmo had already bestowed upon him. In this time, the love between Tuor and Idril had blossomed, and fortunately for the couple, so too had Turgon's respect and admiration for Huor's son. As such, the king's blessing was granted, and Tuor was wed to Idril before the gathered Gondolindrim at the Gar Anan, the place of the gods. Joy filled the hearts of all gathered, save that of Maeglin, the nephew of the king, for he had come to lust over Idril and the station which would be afforded to him should they wed. A spiteful longing and anger soon came to the forefront of Maeglin's thoughts, which was to have devastating consequences for the hidden city and its denizens. However, the newlywed couple was unaware of the devastation to be wrought due to their love, and continued their lives within the city, bringing forth a child, Eärendil, who would come to have a significant bearing upon the dying days of the First Age, and also in turn come to sire a certain Elrond and his brother Elros. Even as Tuor embarked upon the happiest epoch of his life, dark clouds loomed upon the horizon of the Hidden Valley. For the tragedy of the children of Húrin had played out unbeknownst to those hidden within Gondolin, and as Turin Turambar breathed his last upon the Black Blade Anglachel, Húrin was released from his captivity. Yet he emerged a spiteful and broken old man after enduring the combined torture of the Dark Lord's servants and that of the curse of Morgoth upon his children, which played out before his very eyes. His final days amongst the Free Peoples were to have devastating consequences for those he had once sacrificed all for in his desperate rearguard action. A cruel irony given his cries of Ore Enteluva, a day will come again, during the Nernaeth Anoediad, that his final actions would usher in one of the darkest days of the First Age. Yet it was in his cries to Turgon for aid within the Vale of Sirion that the final hammer blow was to be wrought, for in doing so, he revealed to Morgoth the area within which the most significant remaining elven kingdom persisted. Too late did the Great Eagles come to bring this broken remnant of a mighty warrior to a final form of respite, and in doing so, Húrin's final heartbreaking end was all but confirmed. From this day onwards, the Dark Lord ordered a watch to be placed upon Sirion, in order to benefit from the culmination of the curse placed upon the House of Hador. This was to pay dividends for Morgoth, as Maeglin, always seeking advancement within the kingdom, set out to search the lands outside the encircling mountains for metal deposits. This was in direct contravention to the decrees of his uncle Turgon, and in this disobedient folly, Maeglin was captured by the Watchers Morgoth had placed in the region. This elf, formerly held in high esteem amongst the Gondolindrim, had brought to the darkest depths of Angband the cornerstone of what was to be Morgoth's crowning achievement. Under the pressure of torture, in conjunction with the greed and jealousy which resided within the very core of Maeglin's soul, he revealed the location of the hidden city. Maeglin was then allowed to leave, with the hopes of becoming the king of the city under Morgoth's suzerainty, and to ensure this outcome, he would act as a spy within the city for the Dark Lord. Morgoth had also learned much from the Nernaeth Anoediad, wherein his impatience and underestimation of the forces arrayed against him had allowed a spark of resistance to remain amongst the Free Peoples. The elves and Edain of this age had long learned to live with little more than the glint of hope upon the darkest days to persist in their struggle. Therefore, the Dark Lord knew that to ensure for good and all that he would dominate Middle-earth for the millennia to come, even this fragment of hope must be extinguished permanently. For many long years, Morgoth drew to him all the strength he could muster. Morgoth would also send his finest lieutenants, the Balrogs and vast numbers of dragons who were of Glaurung's brood, to complement the innumerable hosts of orcs that comprised most of his armies. Meanwhile, Maeglin would continue to undermine the city from within, a smile on his face disguising the evil held within his heart, which, even though she was unaware of the cause, brought a great gloom over Idril. So it was that when Tuor and Idril's son, Erendil, was naught more than 7 years of age, the hammer blow of Morgoth was to come, one which even a city as well fortified and defended as Gondolin could not withstand. The great host of Angband issued across the northern hills, which were greatest in the height of the city's hinterland, and as such was the least fortified and garrisoned against such an assault. Morgoth had brought to bear all the cunning he could gather, as the attack was to coincide with the Feast of the Gates of Summer. All of the Gondolindrim were awaiting the coming of the sun to sing uplifting songs to celebrate another sunrise free of the dominion of Morgoth. Unfortunately for the residents of the hidden city, the light was to come from the north and not the east. Therefore, the hosts of Angband were able to reach the walls of Gondolin unopposed. Despite the immense fortifications erected and the Gondolindrim's might, even before the assault had commenced, the hope of throwing back the tide was little more than a vain one. Our chronicler recounts, "Of the deeds of desperate valour there done by the chieftains of the noble houses and their warriors, and not least by Tuor, much is told in the Fall of Gondolin, of the Battle of Ecthelion of the Fountain with Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs, in the very square of the king, where each slew the other, and of the defence of the Tower of Turgon by the people of his household, until the tower was overthrown, and mighty was its fall, and the fall of Turgon in its ruin. As the sun rose and the battle was brought to the Hidden Valley in FA 510, the Gondolindrim steeled themselves to face whatever came their way. Even as the hope of their people was extinguished in one fell swoop, the denizens of the last great elven city of Middle-earth refused to bow to the terror which now threatened to engulf all who now bore arms against the great enemy. Turgon was to lead the defence as the High King of the Noldor. However, it was not long until the defenders were driven back to the citadel and slain. Ecthelion and his House of the Fountain had been held back in reserve under Turgon's direction, but upon witnessing the great destruction wrought by the forces of the Dark Lord, he went forth into the fray. The great Warden of the Gate charged at the head of his house and met the Orcish vanguard head-on, with the impetus of a force far more significant than which he could possibly bring to bear. The Orcs were driven back with such ferocity that the gate was almost regained. However, it was at this point that the dragons of Morgoth reinforced the retreating Orcs. Ecthelion's wrath was such that his very name became a war cry of the elves, and in his fury he laid low 2 dragons and 3 Balrogs. However, in the melee, the outnumbered House of the Fountain, supplemented by Tuor's House of the Wing, was forced to retreat. The ever-valiant Ecthelion led the rearguard action, unwilling to give even an inch of ground as his comrades retreated further into the city. His left arm was wounded, causing his shield to clatter to the cobbled streets. The great Drake Uraloke was to assault the rearguard after depositing the Balrogs he had carried upon his back. The dragon would almost trample Tuor and Ecthelion, but the former was able to wound the Fire Drake's foot, causing him to scream, spout flames, and lash out with his tail, slaying Orc and Eldar alike in the process. Injured and unable to fully defend himself, Tuor was to carry Ecthelion away to rejoin the remaining leaders of the city within the square of the palace, where a final great defence of the city was to be mounted. Although Ecthelion had been grievously wounded, he was able to heal himself by drinking from the great fountain of the king, reclaiming enough strength so as to be able to lead the defence of the hidden city once more. 7 dragons would lead the assault upon the square, but undaunted, the remaining Gondolindrim met them with all the remaining strength they could bring to bear. Unfortunately, the enemy's strength was so great that all of the defenders, except Ecthelion and Tuor, were slain. And it was here that one of the greatest duels of the age was to commence. For the very slayer of Fëanor, Lord of the Balrogs, Gothmog, had come forth at the behest of Morgoth and sought to lay low the most valiant of the heroes of that age. Tuor initially rushed forth to meet this towering behemoth, yet despite his own martial prowess and courage, he was easily brushed aside by the flaming blade and whip of the Lord of the Balrogs. Now all that stood between Gothmog and the Fountain of the King was Ecthelion, the Warden of the Great Gate. One of the finest remaining members of the Noldor met his foe within the square, displaying an incomparable grace and strength, despite the exhaustion which had caused his face to take upon the whiteness of grey steel. In terms of the skill displayed, their duel was only matched by Fingolfin in his doomed struggle against Morgoth before the gates of Angband. Yet as was the case in that duel centuries earlier, Ecthelion was ultimately no match for Gothmog, and was wounded by the Balrog, causing him to drop his blade. However, just as Gothmog was to end their fight, Ecthelion sprung forth and wrapped his legs around the Lord of the Balrogs. Sufficiently pinned, Ecthelion drove his spiked helm deep into Gothmog's body, causing the pair to fall into the Fountain of the King. Neither would ever emerge from these watery depths, even as the city was razed around them. Likewise, Turgon, who was among the citadel's defenders until the battle's very end, was laid low by the crushing tide of Morgoth's servants. Even this most ardent defender of the Free Peoples could not stem the tide of Morgoth's malice and cruelty. In the end, the hubris of the High King of the Noldor was to bring not only his own end, but that of his people and the city he loved with all his heart. Following this duel and the death of the High King, Tuor realized that the city's fate had been sealed and sought out Idril and Erendil. The vainglorious Maeglin had sought to claim Idril as his own and laid hands upon her. Tuor arrived just in time to prevent any darker outcome, and upon the city walls the pair fought. Tuor, weakened by the struggle against the hosts of the Dark Lord, was able to draw upon some last reserve of strength and cast Maeglin from the walls of Gondolin to his end. From here, the trio gathered what Gondolindrim they could and sought to leave the city through the secret passages in the mountains, which had been hidden beneath the dwelling house of Idril and Tuor. Glorfindel, who had fought within the square at the side of both Tuor and Ecthelion, was given command of the rearguard, a position he took to with characteristic valor, losing many warriors in the doomed defense of the refugees. However, as the group continued to make its way through the Cirith Thorunath, the second greatest of the Balrogs, Lungothin, descended upon them. Without a moment's hesitation, Glorfindel strode forth to meet his doom, aware that even though victory was an uncertain prospect, his sacrifice could ensure the survival of his comrades. The duel was conducted masterfully by Glorfindel, who held off the whip and claws of Lungothin before shattering the Balrog's iron helm. In the final moment of their fight, Glorfindel impaled Lungothin in the stomach with his blade. As the Balrog began to fall over the cliffside, he grabbed Glorfindel by his hair, causing them both to fall into the deep abyss and to their death. The King of the Eagles, Thorondor, would then recover the body, and Glorfindel was buried upon the high cliffs of the mountains surrounding Gondolin. It is said that beautiful yellow flowers grow upon his grave, despite the rocky composition of the soil, as he maintained his silent vigil over his desolated home. Tuor would lead the remaining survivors through the mountains, whereupon they would travel to the mouths of the Sirion. There, the refugees would merge with the even smaller group of survivors led by Elwing and forging for themselves a minor settlement of sorts. Word would reach Morgoth of the survivors who had made their way from the ruin of Gondolin relatively unscathed. However, in his arrogance, he thought little of these weary survivors of a destroyed kingdom, for he believed his victory to be complete, with naught more than the fractured sons of Feanor left to challenge him, and even then, their oath had brought little but woe to those who had opposed him in years past. As such, the thought of his eventual downfall at the hands of those who eked out little more than a bare existence upon the mouths of Sirion could not have entered his mind. Yet as we will come to see, darkness cannot ever truly overpower the light, if even a bare ray of hope remains to illuminate the path. In the immediate aftermath of the fall of Gondolin, Morgoth surveyed all that he had won through force of arms and the manipulation of the minds of those who had dared stand against him. For all that the Free Peoples had thrown against the Dark Lord, none amongst their number could bring low the great betrayer. Fëanor, Fingolfin, Finrod, Turgon, Húrin-Thalion and Turin-Turambar had all striven to spit defiance into the very eye of the Dark Lord, yet one and all had been laid low by his overwhelming strength. Nargothrond, Doriath and now Gondolin had been razed to the ground, as Morgoth's dominion over Middle-earth had been completed through Maeglin's great deception and treachery. The few pockets of resistance which remained were of little concern to the Lord of Hosts, which now numbered in the millions, and if he were to rain death and destruction upon these enclaves, the consequences would be immediate and tragic. Yet it was to be the same hubris which proved the undoing of Turgon's fair city that would bring about the downfall of the Dark Lord. After Tuor and Idril led the survivors of Gondolin to the mouth of Sirion, they merged with the survivors led by Elwing of Doriath. The arrival of these weary refugees and the tidings they brought necessitated that a new High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth be named, with this title now passing to Gil-galad, son of Fingon. Tuor and Idril likewise assumed the titles of the first rulers of the Havens of Arvenion. The elven peoples who began to flourish upon the Sirion combined the traditions of Doriath and Gondolin, forming their own distinct identity. Similarly, a love of the sea was established, as the mariners of Círdan came down from the Isle of Balar and taught them of the waves and the art of shipbuilding. It is also believed that in those darkening days, Ulmo emerged from the icy depths and pled the case of the Noldor before the Valar. He asked for forgiveness on their behalf for the suffering they had wrought and wished to end Morgoth's dominion over Middle-earth, retrieving the Silmarils in the process. Yet Manwë remained unmoved, and it is oft believed that the time was not yet come for such a drastic course of action. However, the reign of Tuor and Idril was not to last, for the former began to feel the cold, icy grip of age upon his very bones, in conjunction with a longing which appeared to come from the very depths of the sea itself. This longing grew upon his heart until he could resist it no longer, and he took it upon himself to build a great vessel in FA 525, which he named Eorami, or Sea Wing. With Idril at his side, Tuor set off on one final journey into the west, never to feature among the songs and tales of that age evermore. However, the great ballads of the ages to come would tell that alone of mortal men was Tuor to find himself amongst the mortal race with the Noldor he so adored, and his fate forever sundered from that of the race of the Edain. The mantle of leadership then passed to their son Eärendil, who as lord of the peoples upon the Sirion took to wife Elwing the Fair. The couple had 2 children, Elrond and Elros, who would bear the moniker Half-Elven. Despite this peaceful existence, the longing of the sea, which had drawn the father far from his home, was to linger deep within the soul of the son. For the voyages which Eärendil conducted upon the shores of the Hither lands did little to quench the thirst which lay within him, for he wished to sail to the west in pursuit of his parents, and in doing so, bring to those who dwelled far from the sorrows of Middle-earth the true tidings of what now befell Eldar and Edain alike under Morgoth's rule. Eärendil quickly became fast friends of Círdan the Shipwright, who dwelt still upon the Isle of Balar with his people who had survived some of Morgoth's earliest transgressions in sacking the havens of Brythombar and Eglarest. Utilizing the wisdom which Círdan possessed, the pair were able to construct a mighty ship, which came to be known as Vingillot the Foamflower. The songs recount that this vessel was the fairest of all. Its oars were golden and its timbers white, constructed from the birchwood of Nimbrathil, and its sails were as the argent moon. The Lay of Eärendil recounted the great voyages of this young mariner, yet even as he indulged in the calling of his heart, the tale remained tinged with sadness, for Elwing was not by his side, instead staying upon the Sirion, ever in sorrow awaiting her husband's return. Such voyages brought the Lord little joy, as he could never find Tuor or Idril, no matter how far to the west he brought Vingillot. Eärendil would eventually give up and return to the Havens. However, upon this return journey, a sudden fear came over him, and the son of Tuor made all haste for the mouth of the Sirion. For the sons of Fëanor, ever bound by their oath, had become aware of the location of one of their father's jewels. Initially, Maethros refused to act upon this discovery, as he still rued his involvement in the destruction of Doriath and the unnecessary loss caused by such folly. However, his oath soon proved too great a burden, and the Silmaril was demanded to be returned to the sons of its artificer. Elwing refused in the absence of her husband, as she believed that the jewel was the reason behind the flourishing settlement that had been established upon the mouth of the Sirion. This was to have devastating consequences for the denizens of Avernion, for the sons of Fëanor were to commit their third and most brutal kinslaying in order to fulfill their twisted oath to their father. The sons came down upon the survivors of Gondolin and the very kingdom they had previously laid low, and such was the slaughter that many among their number rebelled, instead fighting to protect Elwing and her subjects. Amrod and Amras were slain in the foray, leaving only Maethros and Maglor to continue on in their pursuit of the jewels. The battle was devastating, as too late did Gil-galad and Círdan come to the aid of the beleaguered havens, bringing what survivors they could to the Isle of Balar. Elrond and Elros were to escape the ferocity of the sons of Fëanor merely being taken captive. However, Elwing was not so lucky. With the Silmaril upon her breast, she threw herself into the Great Sea, rather than live to see it in the hands of Maethros and Maglor. However, the Silmaril was not yet lost, for Ulmo bore Elwing's body from the sea, transmuting her into the form of a white bird, and upon her breast shone the mighty jewel. She would then seek out Eärendil and came upon him in the black of night, falling into his arms upon the deck of Vingalit, whereupon she regained her previous visage. The pair were filled with sorrow for the loss of their home and people. Moreover, a great dread for Elrond and Elros's fate filled their hearts. Fortunately, Maglor came to love them in his own way and raised them as his own, even though the weight of the oath still sickened his soul and weakened his heart. Eärendil saw no hope within Middle-earth, and instead turned to the west, and with the Silmaril upon his brow, he brought the Vingilot ever closer to Aman. They first passed the Enchanted Isle and escaped its enchantment. They then passed the Shadowy Seas, leaving their shadows behind them. Then, moving past Tol Eressëa, they eventually anchored in the Bay of Eldamar. Here they met with the Teleri, who were amazed by the coming of a ship from the east, and allowed Eärendil to become the first living man to step upon the immortal lands. However, he would first speak with Elwing, and the 3 mariners who had come with him, Falathar, Elrond and Erandir, and he said to them, "Here none but myself shall set foot, lest you fall under the wrath of the Valar. But that peril I will take on myself alone, for the sake of the 2 kindreds." Although Elwing protested and attempted to join him, Eärendil continued onwards alone, eventually meeting Eonwy, the very herald of Manwë who brought him to the halls of Valimar. Eärendil stood before the mightiest of beings upon the face of the world and was undeterred, presenting to them the errand of the 2 kindreds. Eärendil asked of them pardon for the misdeeds of the Noldor, and pity for the great sorrow for which they had been forced to endure. So powerful and well-intentioned were his words that his wish was granted. The issue of Eärendil's fate was left to be decided, however, with Manwë eventually intoning, "In this matter, the power of doom is given to me. The peril that he ventured for love of the 2 kindreds shall not fall upon Eärendil, nor shall it fall upon Elwing his wife, who entered into peril for love of him. But they shall not walk ever again among elves or men in the outer lands, and this is my decree concerning them. To Eärendil and to Elwing and to their sons shall be given leave to choose freely to which kindred their fates shall be joined, and under which kindred they shall be judged." Elwing chose to be judged among the Eldar due to the influence of Luthien, and Eärendil did likewise to ensure he could remain with his great love, even though he counted himself among the Edain. Vingilot was then brought through Valinor to the utmost rim of the world, where it would pass through the Door of Night, gaining the ability to sail amongst the very oceans of heaven. Upon such voyages through the heavens, the ship was spotted by the denizens of Middle-earth, who bestowed upon it a new name, Gil Estel, the Star of High Hope. Even with such sightings of a mighty ship which bore all the signs of possessing a mighty Silmaril, Morgoth did not foresee the force which was now being arrayed against him. For he believed his conquest to be complete, and the Noldor forever estranged from the Valar. His hubris was to be his undoing, for a mighty host had been prepared beneath the white banners of the Valar, which was composed of the people of Ingvi, the Vanyar, and those Noldor who had never departed Valinor with Finarfin, son of Finwë, at their head. A few of the Teleri were willing to aid the expedition, due to the slaying at the Swanhaven and the taking of their ships by Fëanor. However, the presence of Elwing swayed them to provide enough ships and mariners to ferry the host to Middle-earth. However, none of them were willing to set foot upon the hither land. So it was that the might of Valinor issued forth under the mighty trumpets of Eonwë, and the very mountains shook at their coming. Such was the strength at arms with which they could bring to bear. This was to be known as the Great Battle, or War of Wrath. Morgoth sent forth his full strength, which had grown to such unfathomable proportions that even the Anfalglith could not contain it, and the entirety of the north was aflame with the great struggle of such gargantuan hosts. Yet such a mighty force could not stem the tide of Valinor, as even the Balrogs were slain, but for a few who fled underground, and the innumerable hordes of orcs were laid low to such an extent that they would barely threaten the world for many years to come. The few men who had survived the wars that had come before rallied to the host of Valinor, They would fight with such ferocity as to do justice to the sacrifice of Húrin, Barahir, Túrin, and all other Edain who had fought so long beneath a sunless sky to ensure that day would once more come again for their descendants. However, many of the Edain threw in their lot with the Dark Lord, amongst them the people of Uldor, a fact which the elves did not soon forget. Morgoth now witnessed his hard-won gains being washed away as the unstoppable tide of the host of Valinor destroyed even the mightiest of his servants. This forced his hand one final time, although he would not come forth himself, as he still felt the pain of his duel with Fingolfin many years later. Rather, he would send in his stead the winged dragons he had grown in the deepest, darkest depths of Angband, and so sudden was their onslaught that the host of Valar was driven back with grievous casualties sustained. The war hung in the balance until Eärendil came forth upon Vingolot alongside all the great birds of Middle-earth, with Thorondor at their head. The night was an uncertain one, as the fate of the world hung upon a knife's edge, and the heavens themselves were filled with flame and lightning. Yet at the battle's end, as the sun dawned once more upon a sundered land, and Calagon the Black, the mightiest of Morgoth's dragons, lay dead at Eärendil's hand. He was cast from the sky, crashing down upon Thangorodrim, destroying its towers in the impact. After this, the host of Valinor was poised to carry the day. Even then, Morgoth's cowardice was to rear its ugly head one final time, as instead of meeting his foe upon the field of battle, he fled to the deepest depths of Angband and sued for peace. This was rejected out of hand, and the Dark Lord was cast to the ground and bound once more with the chain of Angainor, with his iron crown fashioned into a collar. The two Silmarils were then entrusted to Eonwë, and at last Angband was purged of its vile cruelties, with a massive multitude of slaves emerging to feel the warmth of the sun upon their skin for the first time in what must have felt like a lifetime. The world was changed utterly, as the fury of the combatants had destroyed much of the north of the great continent, and as such, Beleriand sunk below the waves. And the great herald, Eonwë, summoned all of the elves of Beleriand to depart with them to Valinor as a result. Maethros and Maglor, still poisoned by their oath, refused, and instead demanded the return of the Silmarils. This was rejected out of hand due to the vile deeds committed as a result of their oath, and Eonwë bade them return to Valinor to await judgment. Maglor initially wished to submit to the Valar and beg pardon for his heinous crimes, yet Maethros swayed him from such a course of action. The brothers then crept into the camp of the mighty host and slew the guards protecting the jewels, which roused the entire camp to their desperate actions. Eonwë would not allow the remaining sons of Feanor to be slaughtered, however, and allowed them to leave the camp with the Silmarils. Yet it had been proven true that in the kinslayings they had committed, the brothers had forfeited their right to the jewels, and each of their hands was burned at the touch of these mighty relics of a now bygone age. Unable to handle the despair which now engulfed him, with the realization that his oath had been in vain, Maethros cast himself into a fiery chasm with the Silmaril in hand. Maglor then threw the final Silmaril into the sea, and was left to wander the shores alone, singing of his pain and regret, never to rejoin the elves of Middle-earth. A great fleet was then constructed upon the shores of Middle-earth, which ferried the Eldar back into the west. When they finally arrived, the elves who had long resided in Beleriand dwelt upon Tol Eressëa, whereupon they could look to the west and the east. The love of Manwë was to prevail once more, however, as they were permitted to return to Valinor should they wish, and even the rift with the Teleri was mended in those days. However, not all of the elves returned, and many deigned to reside in Middle-earth. Chief amongst them was the High King Gil-galad, Círdan the Shipwright, Celeborn of Doriath, and his wife Galadriel. Elrond Half-Elven also decided to stay, choosing to live as an elf, while his brother Elros chose to assume his fate as a mortal Edain. From Elros came the great line of men, as he assumed the title of the first king of Númenor, the isle which was raised from the depths of the ocean in recognition of the men who had fought and died alongside the host of Valinor during the War of Wrath. Yet the fate of the Dark Lord still remained to be decided. As a result, he was cast through the door of night beyond the walls of the world into the timeless void. Here, an eternal watch was set upon these walls, while the ramparts of the sky continued to be patrolled by Eärendil upon Vingalot. However, the rot and taint which Melkor had loosed upon the world could not be fully cleansed, and the fruits of his dark labours were to bear fruit in the years to come. For a new Dark Lord was to rise in his stead. So ends our retelling of the fall of Morgoth, and with the eventual end of the War of Wrath, so too came the conclusion of the First Age of Middle-earth. An age defined in paradoxical terms: the might of the Noldor and their great hubris, the determination of the Edain to fight for all they held dear, and their self-destructive tendencies, and finally the might of the Valar compared to their inactivity throughout this epoch. Much was lost when the final page of the First Age was turned. First and foremost was Beleriand itself, yet hope was once more given to the Free Peoples. A hope for a continent guided by wise members of the Eldar, Edain and Dwarves, who could forge for their peoples a bright future devoid of the death shroud of Morgoth's presence. However, such a fate was not to be, and in many ways, the Second Age would provide a smaller scale parallel to that which had come before. However, this is the story for our new series retelling the great battles and events of the Second Age of Middle-earth. But we're planning to cover the battles of many other fantasy, sci-fi and space opera universes, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking and sharing, as it helps immensely, and don't forget to comment. We'll try to read and respond to every comment, as we want to know what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.